In this clip, we're going to go ahead and use the table of values that we created in our last clip to create a graph. So if you're not sure how to set up a table of values, I encourage you to go ahead and check out the previous clip called Creating a Table of Values before we go any further. We're actually going to use the same problem that we used in that question, and let's have a look at that now. Sylvie has a job in sales. Each month she earns $2,000 in salary plus 5% commission. Create a table of values to show her monthly earnings from $0 to $10,000 in steps of $2,000. And in the last clip, we answered this problem and we created a table of values that looks something like this. We set up a column for sales and it went in steps of $2,000 from $0 to $10,000. We also calculated the bonus money that she made on those sales, called commission. And finally, we figured out her monthly earnings. This is what went on her paycheck. What we'll attempt to do now is create a graph that shows the relationship between her sales and her monthly earnings. Before we dive right in, we just need to go over a little bit of terminology. Earnings, her monthly earnings are dependent on how much she sells in the store. If she sells nothing, she earns $2,000, but if she sells a lot, $10,000, she earns $500 more, $2,500. So earnings is what's called a dependent variable. Again, because her earnings are dependent on her sales. Dependent variables go on the vertical axis on a graph. They're the up and down axis on a graph. So if earnings are dependent, sales are an independent variable. And independent variables go on the horizontal or the sideways axis on a graph. So now I'll go ahead and bring up some graph paper and we can begin our graph by doing some labeling and adding a title. Here's an empty graph for you. Our horizontal axis is right here, it goes sideways, and our vertical, of course, goes up and down. Let's add a title. I called my graph Sales versus Earnings, and that's just because, well, that's what it is. It's comparing the sales variable with the earnings variable. It's showing the relationship between the two. Now, a title is very important to a graph, just for the same reason that a title on the front of your textbook is very important. If somebody comes along and has a look at what we're showing here, they're not going to get much information out of it without a title. They don't really know what they're looking at. And using that same logic, we need to tell whoever's looking at our graph what this axis is representing and what this axis is representing. So again, the horizontal axis is our independent variable, which is sales. So I've gone ahead and labeled the horizontal axis sales, and I show what units it is in. In this case, it's in dollars. Now let's do the same for vertical. The vertical axis is earnings. It's our dependent variable, and it's also in dollars. Now we'll talk about the scale of the graph. The scale is, well, do you want your graph really squished in tight or spread out really, really far? How far apart should the dots be spread out? For the horizontal axis, I'm going to look at sales. I can see I need to go from $0 to $10,000, and I'm doing it in steps of 2,000. So I think a convenient choice would be something along the lines of each one of these spaces represented $1,000. Then I would go 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and that would spread out my values pretty nicely. On the vertical axis side for earnings, I need to go from $2,000 to $2,500. So I'm going to choose a smaller scale for the vertical axis. I'm going to go with $50 per space. Now I'll label the dollar amounts on the sales axis. There you go. I'm covering from $0 to $10,000, and each one of these spaces represents $1,000. Let's do the same for the vertical axis now. And you can see I'm starting at $2,000, and each one of these spaces represents $50. There, our graph's coming together pretty nicely. It's starting to look quite nice. Now let's go ahead and add our points on the graph. Our points are sometimes referred to as ordered pairs. And a pair just means, of course, you have two things. So each point represents a value from sales and a value from earnings. Our first point will be $0 for sales and $2,000 for earnings. So we need to go find that on the graph. Well, sales, $0 is right here, and I'm going to go up to 2,000. And there is my first point. I'm going to add that now. My second point will be $2,000 for sales and $2,000 or $2,100 for earnings. So there's my $2,000 for sales, and I just go up until I've hit $2,100 for earnings. And there's my second point. And I can continue that pattern. My next one will be $4,000 and $2,200. Here's $4,000, and I go up until I've reached $2,200. And I'll just add the remaining points. There we go. I can already see that we have a very nice linear shape on this graph, meaning we're making a nice straight line. So let's just highlight that by adding a line ourselves. We're going to connect the dots. And now our graph is complete. And now it's your turn to try some graphing. I'm going to go ahead and give you this table, which we created in the last mini clip, creating a table of values. And why don't you go ahead and see if you can create a graph, and I'll post the solution down here when you're ready. And here's the graph that I've come up with. Your graph might differ slightly depending on how you've chosen the scale for your horizontal and vertical axis. But just make sure that you've got a title, you've labeled both vertical and horizontal axes, and that your ordered pairs match what you should see in the table.